Good afternoon, everybody. Dear Professor Markus Friedrich, dear colleagues, dear students, good afternoon and welcome to the second conference of the second year of the annual research seminar of the Center for the History of Society and Culture, The Worlds of History, New Perspectives and Debates. Since for some of you this is the first time you are attending the seminar, I would like to start by recalling that the aim of this research seminar is to invite distinguished scholars from different fields of history, originating from different parts of the world and working on distinct chronologies from medieval to modern history, to deliver conferences that help us to foster new ways of thinking about how to do history, not only in Portugal, but also on larger spatial scales. We want to challenge, especially the younger generations, to dialogue with some of the most prestigious and innovative historians, with some of the most prestigious and innovative historians, to discuss their research, their knowledge, their methodologies, their problems, the problems they address. This seminar has the support of several institutions besides the Center for the History of Society and Culture. So it is both fair and mandatory to thank them. My sincere acknowledgements include the Faculty of Arts and Humanities of the University of Coimbra and its Dean, Professor Alban Figueiredo, and the Department of History, European Studies, Archaeology and Arts, and its Director, Professor Luisa Trindade. It is now my pleasure and privilege to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Markus Friedrich, from the University of Hamburg, where he is Associate Professor for Early Modern European History. First of all, my apologies for not speaking German. For us, Portuguese, it will be very useful to listen to someone who, as a historian, has a solid German historiographical background. I say this because, although Portuguese historiography, perhaps because it is somewhat peripheral to the major European cultural centers, is a very open and up-to-date historiography in regard to the history made in Spain, France, Italy, Brazil, and in the Anglo-American world in general. However, German historiography is not on the central horizon of most Portuguese historians. Professor Markus Friedrich earned his PhD in history from the University of Munich back in 2003, and 7 years later his habilitación, something similar to the Portuguese agregação, from the University of Frankfurt. That is, he has grades awarded by two important German historiographical centers. Before joining the University of Hamburg in 2013, he had various academic positions at the universities of Munich, Frankfurt, Erfurt, and Rostock, all in Germany, as well as at Duke University and Boston College in the United States. During the past years, he also received a large number of fellowships awarded from some of the most prestigious German institutions, as were the cases of the German Research Council or the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and also some prestigious prizes, as the Heinz Meyer Leibniz Prize, and he was also visiting scholar at the University of Otago in New Zealand. His major interests of research include the history of early modern religion, both Protestant and Catholic, with a particular emphasis on the Jesuits and his missions. In this specific regard, I think he is one of the most distinguished German scholars who was supervised and worked under the direction of Professor Louis Schort-Schutt, a very prestigious historian from the same generation of Professor Heinz Schilling, with whom, both of whom, Professor Friedrich became familiar with the concepts of confessionalization and social disciplining, two very strong perspectives in the German historiography since the founding works of Gerhard Ostreich and especially Wolfgang Reinhard back in the 70s and 80s of the last century. This study, the study of early modern Catholic and Protestant societies and churches, was profoundly renewed and changed after them, and the contrasting views of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation were blurred since then. Other topics covered by Professor Friedrich research are the history of knowledge, the history of genealogy, the history of religious missions in the New World, and also what currently is known as the archival term. He is also very familiar with global history, a kind of an historical approach that we can perceive, for instance, in a very recently appeared book he co-edited with Holger Zaunstock for Verlag, entitled Jesuit and Pietist Missions in the 18th Century, Cross-Confessional Perspectives. There, in this book, he authored a chapter entitled Catholics and Protestants Overseas, Confessionalism and Interconfessional Relations in a Global Perspective, offering a more global approach to the study of confessionalism and cross-confessional behavior. He published extensively in all these fields, including in some of the most prestigious world historical journals, as are the cases of Past and Present, Journal of Jesuit Studies, or the Journal of Early Modern History. Among his works, I would like to pay a little bit more attention to two of them. First, the splendid and imposing The Jesuits, a History, published this year by Princeton University Press, an English translation of the German original from 2016. In a global approach to the whole history of the Society of Jesus, this volume is distinguished by the clarity of its exposition, for having a coherent structure, and for constituting an enormous effort to understanding and synthesis of several dimensions of the life of the powerful Society of Jesus. In a broad spectrum reading, attentive not only to the religious impacts of this new organization, but also to the social and cultural dimensions that its activity implied, Professor Friedrich sheds light on how the order shaped the culture of the Counter-Reformation and was deeply engaged in the establishment of the European Iberian empires. It is not, however, an apologetic book, nor was it written by an ecclesiastic like many of the histories of the society before him. So it does not hide the heterogeneity and the internal contradictions that also shaped the life of the Jesuits in their long history. Nor did it avoid confronting controversial topics such as the Jesuits' role in colonization and the large-scale process of enslavement of African men and women during early modern period. According to Simon Ditchfield, one of the best British living scholars of early modern Catholicism and the Jesuits, who 2 or 3 years ago gave here also a lecture, according to him, and I quote him, "In this book, Markus Friedrich provides the most authoritative single-volume treatment of the religious order that most completely rose to the challenge of making Roman Catholicism the first global religion." End of quote. The second book I would like to mention in more detail is The Birth of the Archive, a history of knowledge, published by Michigan University Press in 2018. It appeared after previous several articles on this field currently known as archival turn in a certain way. I think we can say that these articles, and also some book chapters authored by Professor Friedrich, were a kind of a preparatory stage of the book. Among them, I could mention The Rise of Archival Consciousness in Provincial France, French Feudal Records and 18th Century Seigneurial Society, published in Past and Present in 2016, or the very suggestive title, How to Make an Archival Inventory in Early Modern Europe, carrying documents, gluing paper, and transforming archival chaos into well-ordered knowledge, which appeared in 2018 in Manuscript Cultures. Archives are the laboratory of historians, and historians have an obligation to think about them, reflecting on their construction models and the meanings which are immanent to them, which constitutes an endless debate. This should always have been a crucial lesson for all historians, and today, in the age of archival turn, it is absolutely mandatory. The birth of the archive is a very helpful contribute for this debate. Here, Professor Friedrich tried to explore the meaning and symbolism of archives in European thought, the archive's function, and the access to them. In the book, we can find the history of archives from their emergency in the late Middle Ages through the early modern period, and how archives permeated and transformed European culture. Professor Friedrich argued that the shift of archival storage from haphazard collections of documents to the methodically organized institutionalized holdings of the 19th century nation-state archivals was a gradual and non-linear process. He also recalls us that archives were compiled and maintained by peasants, by kings, by traders, by churchmen, and that the conceptions of archives were as diverse as those who used them. He also explores the complex relationship between archives and political power, something that as historians must also bear in mind and never forget. Last but not the least, the book also deals with the topic of how historians use their knowledge and work with archives to create distinct representations of themselves and their craft. Today, I am sure we will hear about some of these essential methodological issues. So, dear Professor Markus Friedrich, we are very grateful for having you here with us today at Coimbra University, and we are very much looking forward to hearing you about archives, families, and genealogy. The floor is yours.
Welcome, good afternoon also from me. Thank you very much, Jose, for this very nice and splendid introduction, which makes me blush a little bit. It's always uncomfortable to be the center of so much attention, but I'm very happy to be here, and I really thank you very much for the kind invitation. You, but also the Center for the History of Society, of Culture, and the Faculty of Arts, and the Department of History in general, who in a joint effort made my trip here to Coimbra possible. I'm really happy to be here, not only because of the Jesuit sites, which I had to see this morning, but also because I want to use this superb opportunity to present to you something really new for me. So I decided not to bring with me something that you may also be able to read, but rather use this opportunity today to explore and develop some thoughts that are still very much on my mind and really engage you to give me critical feedback. Since Jose mentioned so many other topics, of course we can also enter discussions about all kind of other questions later. In particular, if you're interested, really interested in German historiography, I'm more than willing to fill in everything that you wanted to know and maybe you didn't want to know. So if there is anything we can discuss, I'm more than happy to do that as well. Last thing to mention, you apologize that you don't speak German. Of course, it's rather my turn now to apologize, really not being able to even greet you in Portuguese, but I think I would have offended you if I tried. I'm also not a historian of the Lusophone world, but I tried as hard, you will see immediately, to at least connect my thoughts, at least in a show of rhetorical goodwill, so to say, to Portugal. And this is maybe where we can get started. Because in 1708, in Amsterdam, a book appeared with the very prestigious publishing firm Zachary Chatelain, a book which covered the genealogy of the Portuguese royal family. Its 72 pages presented 15 mostly double-page family trees of the ruling dynasties of Portugal and their related branches. Each table was accompanied by a brief Historica exegesis, highlighting a few particularly important individuals and narrating key events associated with the Portuguese family under review. Surprisingly, perhaps, the book was produced far away from Portugal, in the German Free Imperial city of Nuremberg, by one member of the city's patrician elite, a man named Jakob Wilhelm Imhoff. By 1708, Imhoff had already published a significant number of genealogical works. In fact, his substantial oeuvre amounted to nothing less than a veritable genealogical encyclopedia of the high nobilities of Central, Western, and Southern Europe. Starting his tour d'horizon on the European aristocracy in Germany in the early 1680s, he later published works on English and French genealogies, followed by 2 works on Spain and Italy each, not to mention a few smaller books on individual families. His 1708 book on Portugal, both in its very existence as well as in its style and material outlook, was but one part of a much larger project. In fact, the style and layout of the Portugal book mirrored what one could call Imhoff's typical style of genealogical publication. Most of his books combine, as you've just seen, very well laid out genealogical diagrams with brief but informative historical narratives. These books, including the one about Portugal, and their author are remarkable for various reasons. Not least because these works are surrounded by Imhoff's enormous private archive, containing well over 1,000 letters and 20 volumes of working papers, drafts, and archival notes, all relating to these genealogical publications. These materials, seen in their entirety, provide a unique entry point into Europe's genealogical culture around 1700. And I've been studying Imhoff and his genealogical paper trail quite intensely over the last couple of years. The results of this investigation will appear early next year as a monograph that I hope will also find avid readers here in Portugal. Since it's written in English, it's possible that it's spreading wider than just my usual German audience. My talk today here is partly, but really only partly, building on that research because, as I just said, I'm really using this splendid opportunity today to develop further one basic idea that underpins this forthcoming monograph, but still is there only in implicit ways and needs further elaboration, something that I'm trying to work on over the next years, or I don't know how long it will take me. I want to sketch today the idea, very basic perhaps, but also very crucial to my mind, that we should conceptualize families as communities of knowledge. Put differently, I want to argue for a rewriting of the history of family and the history of genealogy as a history of knowledge practices. What I mean by this I hope to illustrate today in 4 steps, mostly using examples of the early modern European nobilities. I will start very empirically with a brief sketch of how Imhoff worked. This will provide us with an introduction into early modern Europe's genealogical knowledge economy. Second, I will try very quickly to sketch in somewhat more abstract terms what I'm trying to get at. This will be followed in the third part by a few remarks about how the early modern nobility attempted to know their own families. A fourth and final section will at least hint at the political and social motivations for manipulating and curating genealogical bodies of knowledge. This brings me to my first chapter. As a convenient entry point for our attempt to rethink families from a history of knowledge perspective, I suggest we start by asking how Imhoff produced his works. How could a complete outsider, Imhoff was neither a member of the nobility, nor had he ever personally visited Portugal, learn about the history and genealogy of faraway families like the Braganza, the Susa, or the Counts of Lemos and Castro, all of which were discussed in his 1708 book. Let us begin by mentioning that genealogists such as Imhoff were by no means the only outsiders interested in the nobility's genealogy and family history. Quite to the contrary, outside interest in family internal affairs and family history increased and became institutionalized in unprecedented ways from the late 16th century onward. As André Bourguière has argued in a famous article in 2001, the central monarchical state was a key originator of the modern social sciences, including social history and genealogy. Early modern states and royal institutions scrutinized their nobilities in ever more penetrating ways from the outside. Suffice it to mention the French example, where Louis XIV launched his famous Recherche de Noblesse in the second half of the 17th century. Ecclesiastic and civic corporations with exclusively noble membership, too, insisted on ever more explicit and complete control of their membership's pedigree. Proof of nobilities had to be presented to satisfy the needs of an outside institution. The Inquisition in Spain and Portugal probably too scrutinized genealogy to maintain limpieza de sangre. Marriages and inheritances, for a long time already subject to ever more specific genealogical norms, also frequently required the presentation of genealogies to lawyers and courts of laws, so much so that early modern legal handbooks contained numerous stylized family trees by Imhoff's lifetime. Politicians working in Europe's era of the wars of succession, too, constantly scrutinized the society of princes and its internal genealogical structures. All of these institutions looked at the nobility's family structure from the outside and had their own ways of securing and validating genealogical information. Imhoff, our genealogist, too, developed his own set of information routines to build up his genealogical expertise. He started his project in an era where considerable amounts of family-related knowledge, at least concerning the nobilities, was already circulating in public. He relied quite extensively on printed works to build his own genealogies, including, for instance, books of history. Some information for the 1708 book on Portugal, for instance, comes from well-known published sources such as Gerolamo Conestacio's History of Portugal. Imhoff also excerpted specialized genealogical publications of previous generations. In our case, concerning Portugal, he relied, for instance, quite heavily on Alfonso López de Haro, I think no surprise here. Moreover, for many of his works, and this is maybe something less expected, Imhoff acquired knowledge through systematic reading of journals and newspapers. Among his papers are dozens of pages with manuscript excerpts of such news media. And on a few occasions, one can see how the knowledge gained from publicly circulating journals was directly integrated into the printed genealogies. Imhoff excerpted, for instance, a notice in the February 1684 issue of the Mercure Galant about the death of Maria Francisca Isabel Saboya, Queen of Portugal, who had died in very late 1683. And potentially his information about the late Queen came from his excerpt from this French journal. Journals, thus, together with the other printed material, allowed smart genealogists, such as Imhoff, to create basic genealogical knowledge and to stay informed about recent dynastic events, such as deaths or marriages, even from families that lived very far away from where his own life happened. Readers of the late 17th and early 18th century encountered vast amounts of genealogical knowledge floating around more or less unproblematically through the circuits of Europe's public circulation of print media. Imhoff was an expert at exploiting these public resources. But this was not enough for Imhoff, who was very concerned about completeness and correctness of the information he printed. He wanted and needed to dig much deeper than the surface of published genealogical information. Genealogists of Imhoff's generation around 1700 were in general not satisfied with only recycling previously published material. Often, they considered existing printed genealogies to be of modest quality and full of, quote, fables. This was the key negative term he and his peers used. There was, I would even say, a certain bias against simply compiling new genealogies out of existing ones. Genealogy, according to Imhoff and his peers, required research in archives and libraries. As in so many other respects in that era, the archive became a synonym for trustworthy, first-hand, authentic, empirical material, also for Imhoff and his fellow genealogists. And I would argue that genealogy is sort of a particularly prominent force to drive home the role of archives to scholars and noblemen. All of these individuals shared their era's fascination with technical philological scrutiny of medieval charters, manuscript sources, and handwritten evidence. Archive and genealogy became closely intertwined, almost two sides of the same coin. Reconstructing genealogies from first-hand archival and other sources, moreover, was particularly important in the case of Portugal, since, according to Imhoff, hardly any reliable books on genealogy existed at all for that country. Basing his research only on available printed books, thus, would not lead very far. What was needed, by contrast, was additional unprinted, original information directly from Portugal and the Portuguese nobility, who were, as owners of their own family's archives, the best sources of knowledge. But how to acquire such original sources and insider knowledge from Portugal and the rest of Europe, being based in southern Germany? This is, in my opinion, where Imhoff's true achievement lay. With extraordinary communicative skills, with much patience, and with a very clear understanding of genealogy's social embeddedness, Imhoff created a vast and pan-European network of correspondence and genealogical informants. He shaped a republic of genealogists, as I would call it, or a, quote, genealogical confraternité généalogique, as one of his friends, the famous Paris genealogist Pierre-Charles Dozier, once wrote. And what I'm projecting here is a network, a diagram of Imhoff's correspondence network. I drew this myself, and I usually present this picture since I'm a historian working with working papers of previous historians. I think I should lay open my own working papers as well. So I always refuse to transform this into, you know, a pretty computer graphic, which could easily be done, but really present this piece of hand-drawn working document, which still is in my office. What you can see in the middle EWE, Jakob Wilhelm Imhoff, and then his numerous friends and the friends' contacts with other friends. We could talk about each of these individuals for hours now. I hope the visual impression is sufficiently powerful to convince you that he had quite a few people that he would talk to, or rather write to, about these things. And people call this a genealogical confraternity, which I find a splendid term to characterize that. More than 1,000 letters, almost exclusively dedicated in a very obsessive way to the transfer of genealogical knowledge, have come to light so far, and many more, while now seemingly lost, are explicitly attested in the surviving papers. Through these letters, Imhoff acquired not only sources and archival documents, but a wide range of preliminary genealogical materials. His friends and informants sent everything from simple fact sheets full of personal data, only mentioning a date of birth of a prince or the name of a new spouse of a princess. So from very simple fact sheets, only with bare information, bare data on it, to preliminary drafts of family trees, or even to full-blown multi-page narrative family histories. From all corners of Europe, huge amounts of data about noblemen and noblewomen and their families reached Nuremberg through that network, going much, much beyond what was available in print. From these incoming materials, after thoroughly scrutinizing them, checking them against other information, corroborating them, and carefully piecing them together, Imhoff created the books that made his name famous, including the one from 1708 about Portugal. Now, in comparison to other regions of Europe, Iberia, Imhoff's catch-all term for both Portugal and Spain, Iberia was rather difficult for the German genealogists to penetrate. Portuguese and Spanish genealogies were particularly hard to research from Central Europe. From the 1690s onward, Imhoff launched several attempts to learn about Iberian noble families. Concerning Spain, only indirect routes of information were initially open to him, as there was no one in Spain that he could approach. Imhoff had some moderate success when he asked his numerous friends in Naples about Iberian genealogies, Naples being under Spanish domination, of course, seemed to be a reasonable way to get access to Iberian genealogies, and he did receive some material via that route. He also tried to learn about Spain and Portugal via Paris, but this was initially not very promising. Only after 1701, obviously after the War of the Spanish Succession had begun, did Imhoff's French contacts show more interest in Spain and very gradually build up their own knowledge base about Spain for obvious strategic reasons. Now, by far the most successful route for Imhoff to Spanish and Portuguese genealogical materials ran through diplomatic channels. The available evidence indicates that the Nuremberg genealogists relied heavily on Portugal ambassadors to learn about the Portuguese nobility. We do know, for instance, that Imhoff several times contacted the Portuguese ambassador to Paris, the Marquis de Cascais, asking him to procure information and to forward letters to his home country. And I don't know if you can read it. Acceptum mensi natio anno 1698 Lutetium Parisionem legato Lusitanico extremo loco nominato opera Dominus Carolus Hosieri. So via dossier, his not a friend, his strong contact in Paris, he is able to contact the Portuguese ambassador in Paris, who then writes back to Portugal and sends, in this particular case, his own, the genealogy of his own family. And this is the top right. This is typical for Imhoff. He always notes down where he gets things from, which makes it possible for us to reconstruct this in detail. So one route through the Portuguese ambassador in Paris, which he approached via his French contact. Another piece of information, this time concerning the Sousa family, arrived in 1696 in Nuremberg at Imhoff's desk via José de Ligne, the Marquis d'Aronch, briefly Portuguese ambassador in Vienna before becoming embroiled in a complex murder investigation, which I think would be a topic all in itself. So another ambassador, this time from Vienna, who sends material from Portugal to Nuremberg. Concerning Spain, it was the Danish embassy to Madrid, so not an Iberian ambassador to Northern Europe, but the other way around, a Northern ambassador going to Madrid, in this case the Danish ambassador, that proved crucial for Imhoff. In the late 17th century, the Danish had sent a highly erudite nobleman, Baron Friedrich Adolf Hansen von Ehrenkron, to Madrid. Returning home in 1702, von Ehrenkron brought with him many books and became in all matters of cultural activity a key intermediary for the transportation of Iberia, particularly Spanish culture, to Northern Europe. So Imhoff is only one beneficiary of that broader exchange of cultural knowledge. Among the ambassadorial staff of the Danish ambassador was one secretary, Gerhard Ernst von Frankenau, and this man, so not the ambassador himself, but this man, the secretary, originally from southwestern Germany, that's why Imhoff could have known him, but now living in Copenhagen, became Imhoff's most important source on Spanish and Iberian genealogies. Von Frankenau, the secretary to the Danish ambassador, provided much of the material from which Imhoff built his substantial works on Spain. Most importantly, von Frankenau established contact with Salazar y Castro, arguably the greatest Iberian genealogist of the time. It was upon Frankenau's, and thus indirectly Imhoff's, request that Salazar y Castro penned his famous Bibliotheca Genealogica, which Enrique Soria Mesa edited in 1997. Through such correspondences, as I've only indicated here with a few exemplary cases, did Imhoff acquire most of the empirical information that he eventually recombined into his genealogical tables and narratives, including the Portugal book. Now, much more could be said about Imhoff's genealogical knowledge circuit, and this is really what I mostly talk in my forthcoming book about, so if you're interested in this part, you'll find, hopefully, many more interesting things. But instead of going into more detail here, let me conclude this first section with a few general observations. I want to highlight in particular that genealogy as a knowledge practice was extremely challenging, a point every amateur genealogist of the 20th and 21st century will, of course, also underscore. Creating families on paper, as Imhoff did, was a highly complex and often very frustrating activity. Almost never did Imhoff read genealogies that satisfied him completely. Almost everything he received required control, correction, or completion. Imhoff and his friends knew that knowledge about families was never complete and never completely clear. Moreover, almost every detail was constantly open for debate. Genealogical knowledge was also inherently unfinished and inherently preliminary. Families, as represented by genealogical publications, were constantly in the making. New children were born, new marriages were conducted, people die, move elsewhere, so on and so forth. It was never finished. Knowing families was constant work in progress. Nothing emerges more clearly from Jakob Wilhelm Imhoff's papers and publications. It was not for nothing that his working sketches of family trees often look like visual battlefields. And I'm just showing you this particular example, which I show very often when talking about Imhoff, because I think it shows really in beautiful detail just how much constant rewriting and constant renegotiating of knowledge was involved in producing such things that in the end, look very clear, very static, very sober. So this is really the reality I want to get at. Which brings me to my second chapter. These observations about the nature of genealogical knowledge as emerging from my study of Imhoff have gradually led me to a broader point, which is sort of what I'm really trying to get at here. it seems to me that we can usefully elaborate some aspect into more general research perspectives. Imhoff was an outsider looking at noble families from the outside. Hence, he had to work hard to acquire knowledge about the families and dynasties he was interested in. Hence, his understanding of noble families was only as good and complete as his knowledge base. Hence, Europe's noble families existed for him only to the degree that he had intimate and detailed and reliable knowledge about them. Europe's noble families for Imhoff existed only as the result of complex and challenging research and knowledge practices. My general point now is that all this holds true, mutatis mutandis, also for insiders, for family members, so also for the inside of families. Families are created internally by sharing and circulating information about the family members among themselves. Relying on terminology proposed by the great British anthropologist Mary Strathern in 1999, who builds on John Searle's earlier philosophical work, we can call kinship knowledge constitutive. That is, it creates or enacts upon the very act of knowing specific kinship relations. Learning that a certain individual is your relative, say your mother or your uncle, not just adds biographical detail to an otherwise unchanging social relation. Rather, it completely redefines your social and often enough emotional and cultural relation to that person. This is, after all, what kinship relations are about. They put you in a special, culturally predetermined relationship to those individuals considered as kinfolk. Because kinship is intricately connected to social status and identity, what is known about our kinship ties immediately affects how we relate and are related to ourselves and others. Hence, the transformative experience of adopted children learning about their natural parents. Knowledge about kinship is directly performative in ways most other knowledge is not. Given the crucial role of kin formation, I've borrowed that from the title here, I don't know how to pronounce it, but you know what I mean. Given this crucial role of kin formation, we should in the future write family history also as a history of relevant bodies of knowledge, their creation, circulation and cultivation within families. Scholars could start to study the ways in which knowledge about family members is available inside the family, starting from basic questions such as who learns from whom and who doesn't learn about marriages, sicknesses, love affairs, or private plans. Which types of knowledge about which topics are circulated by whom inside the family. Many families have persons that may be identified as keepers of family secrets, as important communicators, and may be identified even as the family memory. And interestingly, quite often, these are not the politically most powerful individuals or the richest family members. Often, these roles are today by scholars ascribed to women, who are said to function as hubs of familiar information. But as far as I know, there is no systematic study of the gender dimension of intrafamilial knowledge dynamics. Moreover, how are the boundaries between internal and outside knowledge about families maintained? How are secret issues kept secret, or who leaks certain information about families to outsiders, perhaps for private gain? Let me stress here that I'm thinking about a very specific form of knowledge here, one that I'm calling who is who knowledge. This is a highly empirical type of knowledge. It is about specific particulars or facts. Family knowledge focuses on concrete dates of birth or death, names of wives or parents, numbers and sequence of siblings or children, individual biographical milestones, activities, or achievements. While anthropologists describe families and kinship structures often in very abstract terms like lineage, descent, patriline, filiation, and so on and so forth come to mind, such an abstract level of language is not predominant when family members talk about each other among themselves. While it is true that early modern sources also use terms like house, casa, race, linaje, to describe their social groups and their internal structure, it is important to realize that family knowledge is about particular people and their highly specific biographical details. Family knowledge is about familiarity with the constantly changing empirical facts of individual biography. This is what you want to know about your family members. One informant of Imhoff described this highly specific and very concrete kind of knowledge in memorable clarity, relating, in this case, not to Portugal, but to Bohemia. I quote the translation. An infinite number of us knows the Bohemian noble families Kolowrat and Schlick, quite important in Bohemia, and others. But scarcely anyone knows how many brothers there were, and who they are, who were the sisters, in what order they were born, who was their father's mother, who were their relations by marriage, their in-laws, their sons-in-laws, and the names of each one. And now the important sentence for me, these things have to be gathered from the house, that is from the family itself. So it's this kind of highly specific, concrete, non-abstract knowledge that circulates in the families and constitutes what the family is. Two levels can be distinguished here, which I would call knowledge of relatives and knowledge about relatives. On the most basic level, we need to know of our relatives, that they exist and who they are. This is genealogical knowledge pure and simple. Finding your ancestor, identifying your distant relatives. Without that knowledge, families cannot exist. European literature is full of great classics that demonstrate what happens if individuals do not know or learn too late who their mother or father is, for instance. Oedipus is only the most famous example of an individual who lacks empirical who is who knowledge about his mother, and we all know how the story goes. Of a more complex kind is who knowledge that fleshes out our relatives' personal lives. Information, say, about interests, character, reliability, and so on. This is also where problematic knowledge often comes into play. Knowledge about, today's language, say, about sexual preferences, unusual career choices, health issues, or financial problems. Families only function if these kinds of difficult knowledge within the family are well managed. The two final parts of my paper will be dedicated to fleshing out, again, about genealogy in all of Europe. According to contemporary lore, he was instantaneously able to recount the full genealogy even of the lower nobility of distant Germany. Nobleman Johann Wilhelm von Wurmbrand-Stuppach, on the other hand, from Austria, was so fascinated with genealogy that he even published his own books of genealogy. One of them you can see here. And Henri-Louis Chastanier de la Roche-Posay, recently studied in detail by Hilary Bernstein, too, was an absolute expert in genealogical matters. Other nobles, while perhaps not being as fluent in genealogical knowledge as these three, were at least interested and found genealogy to be a joyful pastime. Prince Christian II of Anhalt, for instance, from what is today Eastern Germany, while living during the very dark days of the 30 Years' War, once found the time to spend 2 entire days reading a work on genealogies, presumably Antonio Albizi's Principum Christianorum Stemmata from 1612, so fairly recent book. So they existed, the nobles who knew about their families and were interested in that. But I would contend this was probably not the norm, and maybe even an exception. By no means every nobleman or every noblewoman had a particularly clear understanding of who his relatives were. Imhoff's enormous difficulties to acquire complete family trees from the outside reflected an equally prominent uncertainty about family members within the noble dynasties. Genealogical knowledge, to say the very least, was very unevenly distributed among the nobility. In the illustrious Roman Orsini family, for instance, according to a contemporary voice, only one family member, Cardinal Pietro Francesco Orsini, whom we of course know very well because he became Pope Benedict XIII towards the end of his life, So this particular Orsini prince was knowledgeable enough to answer detailed questions to Imhoff. His brother Domenico, on the other hand, Duke of Gravina and head of the family, so not just some minor representative, but the head of the family, quote, contemporary observation, does not dabble in genealogies or family trees. Or a different quotation, quote, it is a very strange thing to note that princes and nobles do not have their kinship tables, their Stammregister, ready at hand and in their archives. German genealogist Nikolaus Rittershausen once complained. Or, again, another quote, I cannot report any specifics about the family acquired, because at several courts nothing at all is known about the family's genealogy, as one of Imhoff's friends typically replied to his request for ever further information. In fact, early modern genealogical knowledge about the nobility was full of unknown unknowns. One didn't even know what one didn't know. Some groups of family members were often simply forgotten, often without explicit intention. They just vanished from memory. Unmarried women, of whom there were many, for instance, quickly faded from memory. Similarly, young-born children of either sex, again, especially those who were not yet married, tended to be forgotten. Furthermore, individuals and entire family branches of supposedly lesser standing or of little public visibility often got relegated to the background or dropped out of genealogists' work entirely. I could present numerous, literally dozens of cases from Imhoff's papers for each of this example. To say the very least, the completeness of genealogical who is who knowledge among the nobility should not be overestimated. This rather skeptical assessment raises a broader question. How were new members of early modern noble families familiarized with their families? How were, for instance, princesses who were married off to a sometimes very distant court briefed in advance about their spouses' families? How and when, for instance, had Maria Francisca Isabel de Savoia familiarized herself with the family of the Portuguese King Alphonse VI, whom she married in 1666? What would she have known about her future husband, and in particular his wider family, before reaching her new home here in Portugal? Or children of the nobility, how did they learn about their family, especially their more distant relatives? The question is hardly studied at all, but several things are clear. In some of the most prominent families, including the royal and princely dynasties of France and Germany, genealogy played at least a semi-institutionalized role at court in the young generation's education. At Versailles, the sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons of Louis XIV were subjected to a rather extensive education in French genealogy. When, in 1693, the sons of Louis were found wanting in their knowledge even of the most important aristocrats at court, Pierre Clérambault, the king's official genealogist and a widely acclaimed expert in all things genealogical, was brought in 3 times a week for 2 years, which I consider quite extensive education. So 3 times a week for 2 years to remedy this situation. A little genealogy was also taught to the young dukes of Mecklenburg in northeastern Germany. In many other families, though, especially those perhaps of the middle and lower nobility, children would have learned about more distant relatives, whether past or present, only through unsystematic, quote, 16th century storytelling. One late 16th century Mecklenburg Junker grew up, quote, being told about the doings of his ancestors. So the key phrase is being told, so it just happens in conversations. Some of these stories about the family's past may have been put into writing for educational purposes. In 1460, the Nuremberg patrician Nikolaus von Muffel, nearing the end of his life through public execution, used his remaining days and wrote down a brief, quote, book of remembrances, Gedenkbuch, about his family and, quote, read it, the book, to his children. So he writes down what he has in his mind and reads out his collected reminiscences to his children sort of facing public execution. Julius von Bülow, another Junker from Mecklenburg too, wrote down in 1635 a brief essay on his family, quote, so that you, the children, may know the family you've come from. Elsewhere, texts of the family past may have been substituted or complemented by images or other visual media. Many noble palaces, castles, or villas featured painted representations of family history, whether in the form of genealogical illustrations or as series of ancestral portraits. We may imagine, but it's actually not so easy to prove from the sources, but we may imagine that such depictions may have been used, at least occasionally, to instill more detailed knowledge about family members into young children's minds. Also, foreign visitors may have found such painted displays useful to acquire family-related knowledge. German Prince Christian II of Anhalt, who we've met a couple of minutes earlier, for instance, visited numerous residences of the German nobility during the 30 Years' War, and he frequently remarked in his extraordinary diary that he very attentively inspected painted genealogies in that respective castles or villas whenever he saw them. So he clearly engaged the visual representations in an active way, we may say. Sometimes, and not least for pedagogical purposes, did influential families even order manuscript copies of genealogical wall paintings so that these representative illustrations of dynastic glory could circulate more widely among family members. Other material representations of family history could equally serve as prompts for genealogical knowledge transfers, including, for instance, coins, buildings, or church decorations. So we may imagine a prince or a nobleman going into a local church where his family has a tombstone or some other relationship, and using these architectural artworks to elaborate on family history. What becomes obvious even from these few and sort of haphazardly gathered cases, hopefully, is the following basic point. Knowing one's own family, that is, knowing who is who in my family, is not self-evident. It's not simply there. Rather, familiarizing yourself with your family requires constant efforts of remaining up to date. What and who we know to be family is constantly shifting and in flux. Families require lifelong learning about and by old as well as new family members to exist. Which brings me to my final chapter. Genealogy in its most basic form requires only a handful of rather sober and technical, empirical pieces of information. Dates of birth, dates of marriage, dates of death, names, and the same information about parents and children. The data you need to create a family tree easily fits into 3 lines of spare text. Yet, this bare framework of data is by no means enough to shape living family connections. To appreciate what role exactly each family member plays within his or her family, we rely on much additional information about a person's status, achievements, shortcomings, and so on and so forth. I'm sure you all have your own examples in mind here. These additional bodies of knowledge about family members can obviously be very delicate. Family knowledge always includes bodies of what sociologists now call difficult knowledge, using a phrase first coined by George Steiner half a century ago. That is knowledge that is not easily integrated into sort of existing worldviews and existing representations of the world. Hence, most early modern noble families were quite carefully managing what kind of information was circulating about individual members. Maintaining silences about certain things was, and is, a crucial practice in family contexts. Modern families often consciously hide complicated facts concerning adoption, homosexuality, prison sentences, or mental illnesses, to quote just a few of the standard cases that would appear here. How was this handled in pre-modern Europe? Instructive is, once again, an example from Imhoff's papers. In the early 1680s, one female informant let him know the following, and I quote, "In his youth, Prince Ludwig of Baden was enamored with one Amalia von Löwenstein, and he made a promise to her concerning the future, that is, he promised her to marry. Because he forgot her, though, once he came of age, and the Princess of Neuburg came to his attention, she, Löwenstein, entered a convent, clearly because the Prince of Baden had just dumped her. I'm sorry, it's disrespectful. Had not continued his affectionate relationship. His cousins, the two sons of Markgraf Leopold of Baden, are badly handicapped. The older one is mute, and the other one is not much better off. Says that female informant of Imhoff. It's actually all true. It is interesting now to note what Imhoff made of this sequence of more or less juicy details in his printed works. He never mentioned the potentially destructive intimate affair of the Markgraf, who was a very powerful and famous man at the time, so not one to easily cross. Better not to mess with the delicate episodes of this important man's private life. Imhoff also failed to mention the younger of the two cousins, presumably one called Friedrich Ferdinand, but probably only because he really forgot them, that is my hunch. Because he only lived for 12 years, so he was not long-lived enough to merit integration into the genealogy. Coming back to our earlier point about groups of people simply dropping out of genealogical memory. Imhoff did, however, mention the other cousin, Leopold Wilhelm, who lived for almost 50 years. And he did mention very explicitly that he, Leopold Wilhelm, quote, lacked the ability to speak. So he did not hide his physical handicap. Some skeletons could obviously be allowed to escape the closet, but not all. Equally difficult for the family concerned was another case, this time relating to the ducal house of Württemberg in southwestern Germany, again, one of the major houses in Germany, subservient only to the emperor. One member of a junior branch of this very important and influential and very tradition-rich family, one, sorry for the long title, Count Leopold Eberhard von Mönchengard, had led a, let's call it, highly unconventional life. Leopold Eberhard was notorious for his extravagant amorous appetite, which culminated in numerous extramarital affairs, divorces, and juicy mésalliances. Since he died without legitimate male heir, though fathering at least 18 non-legitimate children, but he never managed to get a legitimate male heir, so he basically dies without a legitimate successor. Because of that, the main branch of the family stood to inherit his very tiny and otherwise unimportant territory. And thus, the main branch felt obliged to control Leopold's public image. Accordingly, the main branch looked very carefully into Imhoff's portrait of the Count once he published on this particular family in his book. Once again, Imhoff's discussion of this very delicate affair was deemed unobjectionable. He knew how to behave, so he knew how to present this Markgraf's private life, so he did not deny the facts, but he presented them in a very abstract and very reduced, very sober way, matter-of-factly, we would say. A final, similarly well-calibrated discussion of potential family secrets occurred in the Portuguese case. In his book, Imhoff did not gloss over the fact, for instance, that Portuguese King Pedro II had several illegitimate children, including one daughter, Luisa. That woman's story was, in fact, briefly recounted by Imhoff in quite explicit terms, so he does not shy away from mentioning this was an illegitimate daughter. Imhoff, also did not hide the rather complicated family constellation involving Pedro II, his brother King Alphonse VI, and the Princess of Nemours, who stood between the two very different brothers. Relying extensively on Pufendorf's Introduction to European History, where is it? Here? Imhoff did mention Alphonse's alleged impotence and his bizarre actions to overcome this problem, including the king's attempt to have the princess impregnated by one of his courtiers, so that he could have an heir. Imhoff, furthermore, did not shy away from mentioning in generic but very clear words King Alphonse's mental and physical deficits. The king was, Imhoff said, quote, "from childhood on sick in the mind and the body, while being of impudent manners and being enormously and stupidly wild." The story of Alfonso, Pedro, and their complicated family was a delicate affair, but not exactly a secret, we may argue. All of Europe knew about it, and he actually only quotes from Pufendorf here. If such episodes were public, Imhoff seems to have seen no reason to avoid them. Similarly, in the Württemberg case, Imhoff chose neutral words, sort of that is a concession to the family. He chose neutral, non-offensive words, but he did not deny the facts or hide them or gloss them over. If things were truly secret, however, he would probably have been more reluctant. He did not tell the story of the Markgraf's juvenile, amorous adventures. What emerges from these examples is that, in addition to the basic genealogical facts of life, birth, death, children, names, family knowledge also implied a vast and potentially borderless array of additional biographical information, some of which of a rather delicate or difficult nature. Anecdotes like the ones quoted here circulated within families and potentially even beyond, and they were crucial for calibrating an individual's position within his or her family. Both insiders and potentially outsiders knew about such episodes and would have taken them into account when thinking about families. Writing the story of how family secrets were known and how knowledge about family secrets was managed in early modern families is still a future task, but one that will be of crucial importance to understand better the historical role of family in pre-modern and modern Europe. Let me come to a very quick conclusion. Families, understood as a special form of social alliances, are the result of complex and never-ending knowledge practices. Not being in the know about important empirical changes, overlooking a recent birth, a tragic death, not knowing about declining health, or ringing successes of a family member, is a serious blow to one's integration into family networks. Whether or not we believe that families exist from nature, an open question in anthropology, their social life only starts once the relatives are known. Since, as Marie-Lise Tratheur reminds us, kinship is closely tied to identity in uncountable legal, religious, economic, and cultural ways, a lack of family knowledge, if occurring in the wrong moment, could easily have dramatic results. Discovery of genealogical links to other families, however distant they may be, might influence dynastic successions. Discovery of junior branches may shift intrafamilial hierarchies. Knowledge of illegitimate children may influence dynastic decisions. Knowledge about family creates social ties. This is what kinship is all about, after all. As I hope to have demonstrated or suggested at least today, such a new history of knowledge perspective on the family opens rich avenues for future research. A knowledge-based approach to the history of family, perhaps taking as a starting point a careful assessment of the history of genealogy, but eventually going much further, may nuance our understanding of pre-modern and modern Europe's social life. It would add another dimension to what families are, in addition to their role as transmitters of wealth, social status, and cultural power. I personally started realizing that potential of such an approach when looking at one genealogist in particular, Jakob Wilhelm Imhoff. But what is true for outside observers like him is also applicable for an inside perspective. Family are very powerful social groups, and they are full of complex knowledge dynamics. It is the ebb and flow of empirical who is who knowledge about relatives, both past and present, that gives families their shape. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Markus Friedrich, for this very interesting communication that showed us at least that family knowledge is a difficult knowledge, as you said, because it's always